Okay, hi everybody. So here's a thing which may surprise you somewhat. It certainly surprised me somewhat. There appears to be a spider on my camera. That's not the thing, there just appears to be a spider on my camera. Okay, so let's try that again. The arachnophobes out there can breathe easy. The spider has been vanquished, ladies and gentlemen. So here is something which may surprise you, but it appears that religiosity may be on the decline in the Arab world. A little bit of background here. This is something that I have documented, the decline of religiosity, for a number of years now. Primarily in the United Kingdom by dint of the British Social Attitude Survey, which outlines how the decline of religiosity has taken place and how it has been effectively a cohort effect. I've also managed to show some of the same thing in the United States more recently using research from the Pew Research Organisation, and then most recently of all using data from the European Social Survey to show that the pattern that has taken place, the decline of religiosity that has taken place within the United Kingdom, has taken place across most of Western Europe, with each, interestingly, most countries adopting the same kind of pattern, but to different degrees along that path. Nevertheless, where the data is available, one thing that is clear is that Christianity has appeared far more amenable for this kind of decline than has Islam. And so I'm sure you can understand from that perspective, I was somewhat surprised when on the 24th of June this year I read a piece on the BBC News Network entitled "Are Arabs Turning Their Backs on Religion?" Now this piece, which was actually as part of some original research conducted by the Arab Barometer Research Network, which functions in that region on behalf of BBC News Arabic, has 25,000 respondents and is now in about its fourth or fifth iteration, covers a range of subjects, and I want to actually make a second video and cover some of those other subjects because the data, the full data sets are available for some of the other questions that are covered. The full data sets are not available for this latest survey because you know what it's like. You commission these things, you want to tweak the little udders of these things for all that it's worth for the next 6 months or so. But I want to look at the earlier surveys and maybe make a second video covering subjects such as attitudes towards homosexuality, women within these countries, etc., etc. But that's all very much for the future. That's for another video. What I want to concentrate on in this video is this business of a decline in religiosity. So let me show you the data, and you will see that in some ways the BBC has been kind to us here, and in some ways it's been unkind. It's been kind in that it has given us that comparative data so we can look at the situation in these different countries and territories between 2018 and compare it to the situation in the latest survey in 2018-19. We're only talking about 5 to 6 years here, folks. This is not a long period of time. And yet you can see, even though they haven't given us the exact numbers, in Tunisia and Libya, we've effectively doubled the number of people who claim not to be religious. I think that's pretty significant. The numbers that they have given us is that in these regions overall, those who claim not to be religious has gone up from 8% to 13%, and in the under 30s it has gone up to 18%, nearly a fifth of the population. We can kind of break this down a little bit here. If I colour in the ones which are North African, you can see these all seem to be the ones. These are all Muslim majority countries, but they have all had significant increases in irreligiosity over the past 5.5 years. That does not seem to be the case in those countries which we regard as being in the Levant. And in fact, for Yemen, which is the only one on the Arabian Peninsula, that seems to have gone in the other direction. So it seems as if different things are happening in different regions. And I don't quite know why that is. We could speculate about that. But what I was more interested in is trying to work out whether the same kinds of things may be happening here as we've seen in Western Europe, because my perspective has been that Islam is more resistant to these changes for a number of reasons, that it's perhaps a little bit more tightly knit. It keeps a tighter hold over its adherents, and that adherents are less likely to come into contact with other forms of information which may naysay or take them away from their religious perspectives. And so what I found interesting was I went looking online and I found another survey which has been going on for a few years now, which is the Arab Youth Survey. So what I want to do is to show you some of the data from the Arab Youth Survey. Now, the Arab Youth Survey is particularly interesting to me because I think that our experience of what's happened in Western Europe and in the United States has shown us that brutally what is largely explaining the decline in religiosity is the more religious generations dying, quite frankly, and being replaced with less religious generations coming through at the other end. We have what is known as a cohort effect going on, and then people carrying their level of religiosity throughout their life. We've already seen from that initial data, it said that the under 30s averaged 18% having no religion, whereas everybody averaged about 13%. So probably the over 30s are maybe going to be down to about 8%. So you've got maybe twice as many under 30s with no religion. I don't have the actual data because they haven't released that yet, but probably about twice as high a percentage in the under 30s than the over 30s if you had all that data. So we suspect that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to know what the perspectives and what the attitudes of the younger people are within this part of the world to religion. And that is what this survey shows. One point to bear in mind is that there is a skew in this survey. It tells you where they took their samples from, and largely it is from the big cities. And we know, don't we, that on these kinds of issues, generally people in the big cities have slightly more progressive attitudes, slightly more cosmopolitan outlooks on things than people who live out in the sticks. So maybe that's going to try and skew the attitudes a little bit rather than looking at the entire populations. We need to be aware of that. Nevertheless, when we're looking at trends year-on-year data, of course, that's sort of taken into account. And also, I would suggest to you that especially in societies such as this, it's not the people out in the countryside farming and doing stuff like that that are really the engines of change. It's people living in the cities that are more likely to be involved in politics and media, etc., etc. So on with what they have to say here. I think it's really, really interesting. First couple of questions. How strongly do you agree or disagree with the following statements? Religion plays too big of a role in the Middle East. 66% of young people across these regions agreed that it plays too big a role. Only 24% disagreed. The Arab world needs to reform its religious institutions. 79%, nearly 4/5, agreed that it needs to reform its religious institutions. Only 12% disagreed with that statement. That shows a really, really strong taste for reform of those organisations, those institutions, I think. But what is more telling, if we go back to that first question, religion plays too big a role in the Middle East, they also give us the data here which shows the change in answers between 2015 and 2019. This is only a 5-year sampling period, and as you can see, it's consistently gone up and up and up. The percentage who thinks it plays too big a role, from 50% to 52 to 59 to 60 to 66. That seems to be very, very much a trend. Do you think religion is increasing its influence on the Arab world or losing its influence? It's interesting. 49% say that it's losing its influence, and only 29% say that it's increasing its influence. So even though it's more people think it's losing its influence than gaining its influence, nevertheless they are still concerned about the level of influence that it has. Add those two things together, I think that shows a really clear trend in attitudes there. And most significantly of all, perhaps, this is a trend in attitudes amongst younger people. It's not the older people who are dropping off the end. These are the generations that are going to be the movers and shakers for the next couple of decades. And if it follows anything like the same pattern that we've seen in Western Europe and in the United States, we would have every expectation that the next cohort that follows and the cohort that follows after that will show even greater trends in these departments, even lower levels of religiosity, even a greater degree of skepticism to organized religion and religion being foundational in the organization of society than the generation that is being sampled here. It will be interesting to see how that manifests. But what none of this has given us any indication of so far is, why is this happening? Why do these young people in this part of the world have these kinds of attitudes towards religion? I think one thing that we know has taken place in Western Europe, that we know has taken place across in North America, is that the rise of media, first of mainstream media, allowing us to see how the rest of the world functions, how other societies function, and then social media and the internet has broken down some of those cultural barriers, those cultural restrictions that made our worlds very insular, that made us not really appreciate cultures other than our own, that hid us away from some of the possibilities of life, and maybe some of the ways in which our cultures restricted us from exploring or enjoying some of those other ways of living. And as those barriers have fallen down, those barriers to knowledge, duly religion has suffered. It has found itself in a much more competitive marketplace and in many cases suffering. Religion has relied upon a monopoly or a near monopoly of information amongst people as they're growing up to be able to maintain the levels of religiosity that it has maintained. So it's interesting to see what is going on here. What are the attitudes? This is a couple of questions that were asked here. How much do you trust the following to do the right thing? Social media and traditional media. And duly, it's kind of interesting if you look, it gives a net trust figure there, which is the percentage trust versus the percentage distrust. 37 percentage points different for social media, 25 percentage points difference for traditional media. Wow. So in this part of the world, the same thing is happening, which we're seeing in the West, which is not just access to social media, but it is also a fact that younger people are starting to trust social media more than they are starting to trust traditional media. Have a look at this one. How often do you get your news on the following news sources? TV news channels 34%, Facebook 50%. Maybe this tells us a little bit of what is going on. Where do you get your news? This is showing us comparative data between 2015 and 2019. And look at that, social media, only 25% of young respondents in these countries were getting their news from social media sources back in 2015. That has now jumped up to a staggering 80%. That is a sea change in terms of how young people are interacting and learning information about what is going on in the world and about what else exists in the world. I propose that what is happening here is that the Islamic world is not managing to maintain the levels of insularity that are needed to maintain the levels of religiosity amongst upcoming generations. And for me, that is a wonderfully positive sign for change. And hopefully, for the same kinds of changes, maybe with a lag of several decades notwithstanding. I think we all understand that. But that these are societies that are just as capable of undergoing the same kinds of societal and cultural changes that we've seen in Western Europe and North America. Okay, interested to know, do you feel as positive about this as I do? There are still some quite worrying attitudes in these societies. When I create the video that shows you some of the data taken from that BBC Arab Barometer survey, you'll see exactly what I mean. But certainly in terms of change and a decline in religiosity, my perspective is there's quite a lot to be positive about here. Okay, that's finished what I have to say. Interested to know your thoughts. Like, dislike, leave a comment, share the video if you like it. If you like my material, I'll leave you the link so you can support my material. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.